rational theism or atheism. And so we have a 10-minute argument here, 10-minute argument on their side arguing for atheism, and then we have an 8-minute rebuttal from us and then an 8-minute rebuttal for them. Then round 2 will be just the same sort of a situation, and we'll end with a half an hour Q&A where anybody can ask any questions that they want. So we'll just start with a 5-minute intro about the teams and who we are, and then we'll get right into it. And Aaron, am I pronouncing it? Aaron, okay, Aaron, okay. Aaron is our moderator, and he's going to be keeping track of time. He's neutral, and he's going to be calling us out if we're going over our time. And if you could just refrain from any commentary or just try to be quiet the whole time, that'd be fantastic. Also, if you could check your cell phones, just make sure your cell phones are off, and that should do it. We'll take a quick break between each round so people can go to the bathroom if they need to or whatever. Okay, so my name is Kevin Conover, and I am a high school Bible teacher. I teach 11th grade Bible. I teach a Bible class. I also have, I graduated from UCSD with a BA in psychology. I went on to get my master's degree in divinity from Trinity. And I'm currently in a master's in apologetics program at Biola University. And I love doing this. I believe that open dialogue and discussion is the best way to get at the truth. And I am obviously I'm a theist and a Christian.
My name is Bob Siegel, and I'm a full-time Christian apologist. That's a person who gives people reasons to accept or consider Christianity from philosophy, from history, from logic. I'm not of the belief that it's a matter of faith. The way they defined faith in the biblical days and the way people define faith today are totally different things. We're not talking about a God who says, follow me blindly. We're talking about a God who makes himself known. I was actually raised Jewish, but from a very liberal Jewish family, so we were not religious, so I was actually Jewish and atheist at the same time. That sounds like a contradiction to people, but Judaism considers itself to be a culture as much as a religion, and didn't believe in the Old or the New Testament until I became a Christian. I converted to Christianity in my second year of college, and it was through a personal encounter with the Spirit of God. Nothing short of that would have convinced me. I don't think anything short of that can convince you, but what we might hopefully do today is show where God has at least left a trail of breadcrumbs and some evidence so that you might be more motivated to seek him out in prayer.
Hello, my name is Robert Gerow. I'm currently in college, like junior, and I've been a Christian pretty much my whole life, although it took on more significance for me in around high school. And I'm a former student of Kevin's, and I'm currently working with him in his business, Educate for Life, which is high school classes on apologetics, which Bob explained. And I've been really interested in apologetics, pretty much all sides of it, like science, philosophy, history. Ooh, it's really echoey. Yep, so that's me.
Turn it off. My name is Conway. Oh, this is the mic, okay. I'm really tech savvy here, as you can tell. My name's Conway Redding. As you can see, I'm on the side of the Nullifidians, or the non-theists, or atheists. I myself was raised what they call low church Episcopal. Made it through confirmation class somehow because I kept getting kicked out of the class for asking questions that the minister did not, or the teacher did not like. And so I can say that I've had my doubts since I was about 8. And by the time I was 10, things had pretty much gelled for me, and I decided that this was a bunch of hooey. And I've maintained that belief. I haven't run across anything yet to dissuade me from thinking that my stance is in fact incorrect. By training, I'm a clinical psychologist, 27 years of experience with the San Diego County's mental health system, both at the closed lot facility and in outpatient. In the last 4 years of my career, I worked with law enforcement as part of something called the Psychiatric Emergency Response Team, about which I have many interesting stories that you will not hear today.
My name is, oh, that's a little bit too loud. My name is James Hutson, and I am a graduate student at SDSU University studying history, and specifically the history and the philosophy of science, concentration on early 20th century physics. I was raised not quite religious, but then again not quite atheist either. We went to an Episcopal church intermittently, and I also did go to a very liberal Catholic school, so I had exposure to both, both these traditions, and some vague awareness of other versions of Christianity, mostly the mainline ones. But mainly, I did have a great deal of intellectual exploration that I liked to do when I was younger, and I found there were problems. There was sort of soft barriers set up by both of these traditions. So I can't say when I became an atheist, but it was very, very distinct even when I was extremely young. And I never had any problem with it. I very much celebrate the term atheist, even though it's not entirely coterminous with everything I believe. But I can describe myself with many other terms, but maybe we won't get into that tonight. But I look forward to this debate, and I look forward to doing many other debates, hopefully, with our opponents in the future. So thank you very much for having me here.
All right, I'm Jonathan, Jonathan Parkinson, and I'm don't have as much to say about myself maybe as everybody else here, but there's my background. I have a Bachelor of Science in Biology and Biochem from UCSD, and right now I work for a biotech company up in Serna Valley. I was raised Christian and deeply religious, but I lost that at some point along the way. I mean, it was a gradual process. It wasn't an overnight thing or anything, but I would say probably when I was 24 is probably when I would date that back to. And I wouldn't call myself an atheist per se, more an agnostic, but I definitely lean atheist in the sense that I think it's unlikely that there is a God, just based on what we see. And obviously we'll get into more about that later on tonight. So, but just like to thank you all for coming out. Really appreciate it. So, with that said, let's get started.
Okay, we flipped a coin, and we're going first. So I'll start us off, and I'm gonna present here. Why would someone decide it's more rational to believe in God than not to believe in God? Now, this is Anthony Flew. If he was an atheist for 50 years. Towards the end of his life, he decided that atheism was not true, and he became a theist or a deist, probably a deist. But the question is why? Why did he do this? Why am I a theist? I don't believe 100% that I can prove to you that theism is true. I don't believe that. I believe it's more plausible, and I believe it's more rational. That's why we phrase the debate this way, which is more rational. Because we cannot conclusively prove one or the other. We'd have to be omniscient to be able to do that, and only God's omniscient. So, if you believe in him. So, anyway, why did Anthony Flew decide to become a deist instead of an atheist after 50 years is the big question. Now, I think a big part of that has to do with the fact that what's happening is Darwinian evolution is facing a lot of attacks or evidence that it didn't have to deal with in the past. And so what's happening is more and more people are questioning the theory of evolution. This is Thomas Nagel, also an atheist. He wrote a book last year called, or this year I believe, came out this year, Mind and Cosmos, and the subtitle is The Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. This is what he argues. Now, he's still an atheist, and he's relatively famous, but he has real problems with Darwinian evolution. Now, if Darwinian if Darwinism is eventually proven false, there aren't many options left as far as where we all came from, or where the universe came from. If the universe and life didn't create itself from nothing, then by default you're left with God created everything. Now, there are a few people who might believe that there is a third option, and that the universe is eternal. But generally speaking, most cosmologists don't agree with this theory. The theory that the universe is eternal and therefore does not need to be created by a creator. That has generally been proven wrong, and currently is not accepted by I would say the majority of cosmologists and those who study that. This is a website called Descent from Darwin. Now, On the side here, they have a thing that says, we are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. Now, what this is it's a site where people are saying, look, there's a lot of problems with Darwinian evolution, and we don't believe that it can explain properly the complexity of life that we see around us. And a lot of, this is only PhDs can sign on to this, and a lot of scientists are now signing on to this. Now, please don't make the mistake that I'm saying that, okay, we have a lot of these people that say this proves God's real. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if you have this many scientists signing on to something like this, then there's reason to question the theory and to look at other alternatives, is what I'm saying. So here are some of the people that have signed on. Paul Ashby from Harvard University, Fred Schroeder, Columbia University. These aren't just like Joe Schmo down the street. Rutgers University, James Hawk, Physics and Astronomy, USD, right here in San Diego. Joseph Atkinson, MIT, Organic Chemistry. Raymond, I don't know how you say that, Princeton University. David Carta, Bioengineering, UCSD. Walter Bradley, Distinguished Professor of Engineering, Baylor University. Stanford University, Cornell University, UCLA, Purdue University, UC Davis, Cornell University, and on and on. This is 20 pages of scientists that have signed on saying, we doubt that Darwinian evolution can explain the complexity of life that we see around us. And again, my point here is not to say, oh, this proves God. It doesn't. Okay, but what it does is, it explains why somebody like Anthony Flew, or it begins to make you wonder why somebody like Anthony Flew switched after 50 years from atheism to deism. Okay, so the main reason that this gentleman switched is something he called integrated complexity. Okay, and what that essentially is that the universe around us is so incredibly complex, and as science has dug down deep, they've found that the complexity goes very, very deep. Not only down on the microscopic levels, but also to the macro levels when you look at the universe as a whole. This fellow here, a very famous evolutionist, George Wald, he stated, time is in fact the hero of the plot. The time with which we have to deal on is of the order of 2 billion years. What we regard as impossible on the basis of human experience is meaningless here. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One has only to wait. Time itself performs the miracles.
10 seconds remaining, Team 1.
Oh, wait. No. We have 10 minutes. That's only been 4 minutes.
I have a 5-minute opening statement.
Oh, no. We just did the opening statement, I thought.
No, the opening statement was just...
Those were introductions.
Those were introductions.
Uh-oh.
We can go. I guess we can work your deal. Just give it 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. So time itself performs the miracles. Essentially, this is this concept that's happening here. Do you agree with this statement? Anything's possible given enough time and enough tries. Okay, now a lot of people actually think this is the case. Some people think that if you have enough time and enough tries, that eventually anything can happen. But is this really true? That's a big question. We can compare this to a guy throwing a dart at a dartboard. If he has one shot to throw the dart and hit the bullseye and he's standing right next to the dartboard, he is going to hit it. Okay, he has a very good chance. Some people think that if you have enough time and enough tries, that eventually anything can happen. For example, everything we see in the universe today. But let's think about this. If you move the guy farther away from the dartboard, but he has 10 tries to hit it, his tries have gone up, but his chances of hitting it have actually gone down. That's because there's two factors involved here. In a universe as big as ours, what are the chances that a planet as complex as ours, with life as complex as ours, exists by chance? No God involved. Are they excellent, good, slim, or no way? Now, if we move him up to 100 tries to hit the bullseye, are his chances excellent, good, slim, or no way? You couldn't answer this question if you didn't have more information. You need to know not only how many tries he gets, but also how far away he is. Okay? If all of a sudden he's across a football field, well, that changes everything. He can get 10 tries instead of 1, but he's going to have a less chance of hitting that bullseye. Now, we can move his chances up to 1 million. Okay, he has 1 million tries to hit the bullseye. What are his chances? We have to know how far away he is from the bullseye. Well, if he's all the way across the United States, you can give him 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million tries. It doesn't matter. It's not a rocket-propelled dart. okay, he's not going to hit the bullseye. And the reason this relates to what we're discussing here is this. There are two sides to the equation about whether we can exist by chance or not. Okay, there's the number of trials you get. This would correspond to how many times you get to throw a dart. And there's the number of factors required for life in our universe to come into existence. This would correspond to how far away the dartboard is. How hard is it to get a planet Earth with life on it? That's the big question. And that's the missing factor. Because if it's hard enough, it approaches impossibility. Okay, and this is part of the reason I believe it's more rational to be a creationist than it is to be an atheist. Could the universe and other things form by chance given enough time? I'm not going to get into the details of this, but this is just making a simple cell. It's not an easy process. In fact, humans, as smart as we are, haven't been able to do it. Considering only the racemization aspect of 19 of the 20 amino acids, this process would require 47,120 successive selections, each with probability of half. What this means is you would have to flip a coin. It's like flipping a coin 47,120 times and getting heads every single time. That's just to get a simple cell. Okay? That is a crazy probability. This is no God involved, purely by chance, roll of the dice, which is what evolutionary theory is and atheism is. No God involved. Now, this is called the universal probability bound. There is a limit to how many trials evolution gets to produce a planet like ours and life like ours. There is an upper limit. Okay, the evolutionists believe that the universe is 15 to 20 billion years old. So there's only so much time and so much matter in the universe that you can actually keep flipping the coin. Eventually you run out of matter and you run out of time. Well, there are estimates of what it is. One of the estimates is 1 in 10 to the 150. This is like tossing a coin 1,000 times and getting heads 1,000 times in a row. Remember, just to get a simple cell, it was over 47,000 times. This is statistically, you cannot go beyond this. Anything beyond this becomes impossible because you just don't have enough time in the universe, you don't have enough matter in the universe to get the trial and error process going, which evolution requires. Remember, it's random, mindless chance that's producing life like us and over the 1.3 million species on Earth, random chance. That's what atheism says. Okay. Now, some people try to get around this by using what's called the multiverse. The problem with the multiverse is, now the multiverse gives you more time and it gives you more tries. The problem with the multiverse is it's not scientific. Okay? Now, it's fine if you want to propose it, but it's metaphysics. It's basically religion. 10 seconds. What? Okay, it's basically religion. And so essentially what I'm saying here is this. It takes dogma.
Time.
Okay. I will...
Okay, and we're going to proceed to Team 2 for a 10-minute, sorry about the confusion, a 10-minute opening statement. Yes.
I guess this debate tonight is interesting for me in a lot of ways because I actually used to be a creationist. Again, when I was a kid, I think I may have mentioned this, I was raised in a Christian family and I was taught that all life was created in its current form. And it wasn't really until I started to study science that I realized that didn't make any sense. I guess just to start out with, let me go back to what I believed when I was a kid, which is, of course, the Noah's Ark flood story. The alternative to evolution that most creationists usually propose is the Noah's Ark flood story, or some variant of that. And I'm sure you've all heard how God created life and then destroyed it, and Noah saved the animals with his wooden boat. And this is a cute story, and it's fun, but it just doesn't make any sense, and you don't have to know anything about science to realize that. You can just ask yourself some common sense questions. If God loved everybody, why would he create tapeworms and smallpox? If God loved everybody, why would he decide to destroy life with a flood? That doesn't seem very loving to me. Where would the water in this flood come from? Where would it go afterwards? Why isn't it still here? How would you fit thousands of dinosaurs and woolly mammoths and sheep and so forth into a 400-foot boat? And how would they get back to different continents after the flood? How do rattlesnakes get back to America? Did they fly here? You know, I could go on, but the story doesn't really make any sense. I think you get my point. And we know it's not true, because we can see that the Earth is much older than Genesis would have you believe. You can figure that out just by looking at rock formations like the Grand Canyon or the White Cliffs of Dover. You can see these took a long time to form. You can figure that out by looking at, fossils in Antarctica. You can find fossils of mammals and warm weather plants in Antarctica under the ice. How did those get there if the Earth is 10,000 years old? And it's when you look at stuff like that that you realize, wow, the Earth really has been here for a long time. But so if the Genesis story is not true, then how did life, as we know it, come into being? And this is where we come to the theory of evolution, which Kevin has been talking about here at some length. Evolution is just genetic change over time. It doesn't have anything to do with how the planets came into existence or how the universe came into existence. It's just genetic change over generations in a population. And to a lot of people, it seems counterintuitive that this could create new features. I think Kevin was talking about how he doesn't buy that this could create the diversity of life that we see. But the interesting thing here is that we've actually been able to see evolution in action, creating new features and new traits. And hopefully we'll talk about some of this later on too. But we've been able to see we've seen bacteria evolve resistance to antibiotics. We've seen insects evolve resistance to insecticides. We've seen evolution create new genes, both in the lab and in the wild. One interesting example is nylon-eating bacteria. Nylon was just invented back in the 1930s. It's a relatively recent invention. But you have today bacteria that can break down byproducts of the nylon manufacture process using enzymes that are found nowhere else in nature. These are enzymes that have come into being since the 1930s. And we can, by comparing the DNA of those genes with other related bacteria, we can see where they came from. They were created by mutation and natural selection. And just going on here, we can see examples of situations where new species have come into being over the last couple centuries. One example is what's called the goat's beard flower, which is found here in western North America. We introduced 3 species of that plant to North America back in the early 20th century. Today, you can find 5. And those 2 new species are the result of what's called a polyploidy event, where the daughter plant has more chromosomes than the parent plant, because it's through the same process that causes Down syndrome in humans, but plants, for various reasons, are able to get away with that better than we can. So again, we've actually seen new species evolve. We've actually seen new genes evolve. And when we look at the fossil record, we can see that life has been evolving and changing ever since it came into existence on this planet. So when creationists argue that evolution can't happen, or it can't explain how new features come into existence, the evidence is out there. It does happen. From a certain perspective, though, I guess you could say, how is this relevant to religion? Obviously, there are many scientists who are religious. And usually when you talk to these people, they'll say, well, I think Genesis is an allegory, and God used evolution to create life as we know it. Now, I don't buy that myself personally, because I think that the idea of a God who can just sit back and watch something like the Holocaust unfold and not do anything about it, to me, is a very crazy idea. But, that's definitely a fair argument. You could make that argument. You could say, maybe Genesis is an allegory, and maybe God moves in mysterious ways. But the interesting thing is that many creationists here, or many Christians here in America, haven't even progressed to that point yet. You talk to a lot of Christians, and they still want to deny evolution because it makes them feel uncomfortable, or because they're afraid that, if they accept this, they have to drop their faith. In other words, they're worried that if they accept the truth, they have to drop their faith, and that's kind of a shame. So, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about this in more detail later on tonight. But what I really want to share with you, most of all, is the story of how we came into being, the story of our origins, which is more amazing and more remarkable by far than the story you have in Genesis. Because thanks to modern science, we know that you and I, and all of us in this room, are descended from bacteria. And everything in this room is made from the ashes of dying stars. And at first you may find that baffling, or surprising, or unsettling. At first that may make you feel lost or alone. I think that once you become better acquainted with the evidence, and once you're more familiar with it, I think you'll learn to welcome this truth, as I have. It's as a wise man once said, for you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free.
Okay, we move on to rebuttals, and Team 1 is going to have a rebuttal of 8 minutes.
I guess I'll get on. Oh, is there my comment? Hello? Okay. I I guess I'll just try and... Whoa. Seems to be a bad spot for this mic. I don't know. But I guess I'll just try and cover a few of those points. It was kind of like, covered a lot of topics really quickly, like if the flood story is believable, why God allows certain things to happen. So I guess, first of all, I guess I would like to point out that the flood story only makes sense in the context of how Christians view the history of the earth, where for a young earth creationist, there weren't millions upon millions of species when life was created. There are several thousand basic kinds of animals, and actually I found that a lot of evolutionists are not very aware of what scientific creationists think, especially modern ones, and they don't really understand generally what they think about evolution specifically. About evolution does produce new traits, evolution is the reason that bacteria evolve resistance to certain drugs and so forth. But actually, young earth creationists believe in rapid speciation, you might say. But the thing is, speciation doesn't always mean that much, and it's not something that turns a bacteria into a human, no matter how much time you have, kind of like Kevin was saying. Because the distance you have to travel from bacteria to human is way too far to throw that dart at the bullseye. I mean, speciation, in the London Underground, there's like a new species of mosquito that no longer breeds with the London's above ground mosquito. So, but you still have two mosquitoes without that much different genetic information, without drastically different body traits. They're not moving towards being any different kind of organism. I mean, evolution definitely occurs. Young earth creationists believe evolution occurs. But the argument is, what can evolution actually accomplish? So, oops, sorry. For the flood story, let's see. I don't know where to go next, actually. Sure.
Okay, regarding the flood, basically there are 8,000 different kinds of animals that would have needed to fit on the ark. There have been plenty of studies done on this, how many animals would have existed at that, or approximately how many different kinds of animals would have existed and how much room you would have needed on the ark. The Genesis story gives specific dimensions to the ark, very specific dimensions to the ark, and they've calculated it. You would fill up probably about 30% of the ark with the amount of animals plus food that you would need on it. You'd still have plenty of room in the ark for that to take place. You can actually go online, go on my Facebook page. I have a link to it up. All the studies that have been done showing the dimensions and everything else. Looking at how big the animals would be. The average size, if you take all the animals together, is the size of a sheep. Okay, and basically you'd have to have 30,000 sheep fit on the ark. They would all easily fit on the ark. As far as rattlesnakes coming to America and stuff like this, how did they get there? Listen, if you want to talk about, you can make theories about how things get everywhere. Evolution is full of theories and assumptions about how did a cow turn into a whale, okay? Because evolution believes that you have to, or wolves, okay? They believe whales actually evolved from either, and correct me if I'm wrong, either from cows or wolves. So first the fish came out of the ocean, then they went back into the ocean. Now nobody has any scientific evidence of how that worked, but there are plenty of theories of how that worked. So we can't say it's wrong simply off that. And also, we have to keep in mind here too, that we're not debating evolution specifically versus creation. We're debating theism versus atheism. Okay, so the big question here is, what evidence do you have that God is not involved? And if we came from stars, which John said, that violates what's called the law of biogenesis, okay? If you know Louis Pasteur, that life does not spontaneously generate. Life does not come from non-life. We can't just say, okay, we came from rocks somewhere along the line. It doesn't work like that. So that's unscientific. And again, that's another reason why it's more rational to believe in God than not to believe in God. Because atheism flies in the face of science. It just doesn't make sense. Again, the law of causality. What caused the beginning? Where did it all come from? You have to have something cause the Big Bang, or where all the stars came from. Where did the matter come from? It can't just have, developed by itself and made everything by itself. That just doesn't work. You guys want to add something? Okay, we still have more time?
You have more time.
Okay.
You have about close to 3 minutes.
Okay, again, I just want to clarify, along with the same lines with what Robert said. Christians or creationists believe in natural selection and adaptation. What we do not believe in is that one species changed into another species. All dogs originated from two dogs. Okay, back in history, two dogs, they mated, they produced everything from Great Danes to Chihuahuas. Okay, that's the facts. There's no problem with that. There's no problem with that. What we don't believe is that one type of animal, one kind of animal, changed all the way into another. Genetically, there's a limit on genetic variation, the kind of adaptation that you can have within each species. In fact, our bodies try to maintain the type of species. The law of biogenesis, again, says that all creatures reproduce after their own kind. Just think about a horse and a donkey. When they mate, they make a sterile mule. If they can't even produce an animal, the two of them, which are very similar, can't make an animal that can reproduce and change, how in the world are two animals going to get together and make something completely different than what they are, even over time or whatever the case? There's a maximum limit on variation within each species. And species is a loose term. It's not always clearly defined, but generally the way people define species is two animals that can mate and produce offspring that can also produce offspring are a species. Now again, that's a loose definition, but generally, again, creationists, hey, the whole thing with DDT and roaches adapt to DDT, to different pesticides, and they adapt and they have to make new pesticides. Yeah, we're fine with that. That's all scientific. It's proven. It's testable, repeatable, observable, falsifiable. What we're not okay with is what is not observed, which is a lower species evolving into a new species. That's what we're not okay with.
Okay, Team 2 will have an 8-minute rebuttal.
One hardly knows. Yeah, one hardly knows where to begin. First of all, let's start with the business of the probability. Kevin, you seem to assume that the events in a probability matrix are independent, and that is not always the case. And that's why a man named Bayes developed something he calls Bayesian probability, conditional probabilities, where the probability of an event later in the chain is changed by the events that have occurred before, so that in fact after a bit, it's like if you're familiar with the question of degrees of freedom, like if you have a matrix, let's say a 2x2 matrix, and you know what's in 3 of the matrices, what's going to be in the 4th matrix is pretty much determined. The probability that's going to be there is 1. 2, the universe, in order to even talk about the probability of the universe existing the way it does, you'd have to have some idea of what the sample space was from which you were drawing your probabilities. There is no defined sample space for the universe. We do not know. We have never seen a universe created. We're just in the dark, so it just is nonsense to talk about the probability of the universe. Once a thing exists, the probability is 1.0 of its existence. The universe exists. The probability that exists is 1.0. Perfect probability. There are a couple of other things. You mentioned the business about the above ground and underground mosquitoes, and you said they're not different species, but then you gave evidence, and as you define a species as being something that, a separate species as being something that can't interbreed with another species, you got 2 different species there. I'm sorry. You said it yourself. They can't interbreed. 2 different species. I'd like to go into another thing about this whole business of theism versus atheism. And I'm going to begin by reframing the fundamental belief of most religions, which is there is a God, or there are gods, as basically a hypothesis rather than an incontrovertible fact. Religions further hypothesize that this God or these gods has or have certain characteristics, chiefest among which, at least in the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, omnibenevolence, and infinite wisdom. In addition, it is often stated that mankind stands in relationship to this deity as that of children to a loving father. Now the question becomes, supposing that such a deity has a real existence, what would we expect to observe in the world? Insofar as our observations do not match our expectations, we must reconsider the validity of our hypothesis that this god or these gods have a real existence. And I'm going to suggest that there are multiple observations that we can make in the world, mostly of bad things that seem to argue against the existence of a deity as the deity is currently, is often defined. And I mean, there are many of them. I've got a list of natural disasters, and of course we have, as of yesterday, this horrific example from Newton, Connecticut. I find myself wondering, in a universe overseen by a loving God, how could this possibly happen? And don't tell me about free will, because I have an answer for that.
Okay, that concludes Team 2's rebuttal. Were we going to have a break between rounds?
I think we should have
You indicated a break because we've currently gone through the opening statements, first round, and rebuttals. Should we call what, five minute break?
Okay.
5 minute break.
5 minute break.
Something of a rebuttal, just because we've already gotten a discussion going, and within that I'll weave in other points that I think need to be brought up in this. But honestly, I didn't hear an argument for theism. I heard arguments about how our current understanding and the development of biological diversity on the Earth is challenged by a few people on the outside of the mainstream, even if they do have degrees from Ivy League schools. I'm not impressed. I mean, I'm really not. It's just because you might have graduated from a decent institution doesn't mean you're going to be right about everything, and it doesn't mean that you're not going to make arguments for some very, very bad personal reasons. And I think that's where most of it comes from. We're still feeling the effects of centuries of religion coming down to us even today, even though we've gotten out from under a lot of it. I just don't buy it. And there are reasons why these criticisms of Darwinian evolution, I don't get Darwinian evolution. No, it's evolution. No, I mean, we shouldn't be making distinctions like that. Organisms, they genetically vary. DNA mutates. We know this. That's just evolution. There's a reason why the views, the criticisms are not the mainstream. That's because they're generally baseless. And Conway talked about this a little bit, but you start off with a result and you think, oh, the result is so improbable. Humans are so improbable. Oh, these peculiarities about human beings are so improbable. Look how wonderfully adapted we are. And yes, it's true. Human beings, like a lot of other species on this planet, are very, very rare in their particularity. That doesn't mean we're any more rare than any other organisms that could have evolved. In fact, we were no more rare than a bunch of other organisms that did evolve and eventually went extinct. I mean, we were not necessarily the pinnacle of biology on the surface of this planet. We happen to be one of the more dominant species because we can control our environment very, very well, luckily. And who knows, there may be other species that come around long after this. Maybe on other planets there'll be species that are much more advanced than we are. But as far as we know, just because we seem to be in a very conceited position, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are the top pinnacle of everything that was supposed to be achieved in this world. I can't buy that. That just seems absolutely ridiculous to me. But getting back to the original point, I didn't hear an argument for theism. I heard criticisms about Darwin and supposed ideas derived from Darwin and scientific theories based on his ideas. I don't get why, if your belief, your confidence in a certain explanation, whether it's scientific or not, automatically justifies you to jumping from that, making a very, very, very bizarre transition into believing a bunch of supernatural mumbo-jumbo. I just really can't buy that. Because there's any number of supernatural things that you could believe in. You could believe in a pantheon of gods. And I know the argument is actually, what is more rational, theism or atheism today? Theism doesn't necessarily mean Christianity. It doesn't necessarily mean monotheism in the traditional sense. It doesn't even necessarily mean any of the theisms that have developed historically, whether they be polytheisms, monisms, and pantheism. No, it doesn't even mean those. It means just about any one that you could develop in your mind by yourself, alone in your room, without any input. It could mean just about anything whatsoever. So I'm having a hard time getting from, oh, there are some criticisms of Darwin, which may or may not be valid. They're actually not valid, for reasons that I don't want to get into, because actually I know Jonathan probably wants to elaborate more if we go into that today. But even if they were valid, which I seriously doubt we'll ever have valid criticisms of what we've understood about biology now, but even if they were, that doesn't automatically mean that you should jump to really ridiculous conclusions about supernatural things being somehow the cause of what we observe in the natural world. Every time we've actually gone looking for an explanation, generally, we found out that scientific natural principles are at work, even if we don't know what they are at the time. And even the things that we don't have explained right now doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be explained by supernatural methods. No, there's a very strong possibility that we're going to continue to get natural explanations for all the things we've observed about the world so far. We've developed an entire litany of natural laws and scientific theories which explain the natural world in so much detail, in so much precise detail, so wonderfully and so beautifully. It's generally underappreciated by the majority of people, even when they are actually studying this stuff, just how much we've achieved by careful, deliberate observation, experiment, and rational quantitative analysis of the world. Most people don't realize just how much we've achieved with that. But on the other hand, people often give way too much credit to jumping to a conclusion when we actually really don't have a conclusion. And that's what supernaturalism is. It's essentially sticking in something that you don't have any necessarily any justification for. And it doesn't explain anything rationally, because it's not very well circumscribed. Supernatural explanations don't solve anything. They just act as sort of a... But anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. But I wanted to bring it back and mention a couple other things, because we talked about biology to a great extent tonight. I also wanted to briefly mention, and we'll probably get back to this more later, about what Kevin said about the probabilities of a universe coming about with these particular qualities. I mean, it's been very popular lately, the cosmological arguments, and there's a whole series. There's many different variations of these. But essentially, there's a claim that the universe could not exist naturally without some sort of supernatural push, or whatever you want to call it. Again, I'm not seeing any reason to have a supernatural explanation just shoved in there. For this exact same reasons that we don't need any kind of supernatural explanations for life. And I don't know where Kevin got the idea that, oh, life cannot come from non-life. First of all, we know that life is made out of chemicals which are non-living. We know that the basic building blocks of life come from stuff that is not alive. We can actually, to a great extent, put together things which are not alive, and they are at least approaching something which is alive. And we may be able very soon to assemble things which are actually alive in and of themselves. And we've actually gotten to the point where we can completely remove a genome and put a new one in there. I mean, there's nothing special about life in and of itself. You don't need some sort of ectoplasm presumption that there is some sort of quality metaphysically that life possessed. And in addition to that, there's a question about just what qualifies as life. I mean, we have a rough idea of what we mean by life, but there's no universally agreed upon definition of where life ends and where non-life begins. We all know that organisms based on carbon, that's the common property amongst life that we have now, but there are other possibilities. Life perhaps based on silicon because it has a chemical structure which would be conducive to putting together molecules somewhat similar to those based on carbon. There's a possibility of artificial life. We don't know if we can build, intelligent machines, sentient machines. We don't know that yet, but it's still a possibility that remains out there to be investigated. And none of this requires any supernatural explanation either. And in other words, we don't have a clear criterion between life and non-life. It's completely arbitrary at this point, what we choose to call life and what we choose to call non-life. So, I mean, I want to make that explicitly clear. That's looking at it from our specific perspective. And that hints at something else. I haven't gotten a clear idea of what the other side means by God. Because, as I was hinting at earlier in this, I can think of any number of gods. And they don't all necessarily adhere to a traditional definition. But I would very much like to hear just what it is, in as much explicit detail as possible within the time constraints of what we have, as to just what this God means, because as far as I can tell, everything they said was compatible with some sort of pantheistic concept, or it was compatible with some sort of vague amorphous entity, or it could be completely compatible with some kind of ancient polytheistic pantheon in the traditional sense. I mean, that's all I've heard. And I think I'm out of time, but thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to Team 1 for a 10-minute argument.
And my rebuttal will be later. This is my opening argument. I'm going to start with an argument from personality. And we were getting into this a little bit when he talked about artificial intelligence. Maybe we will someday create a computer that can think for itself, that's conscious, that's self-aware. But if we do that, if we manage to create something sentient and conscious, make no mistake, it'll be because we are sentient and conscious. And now let's just go back a little bit. When we're looking at this universe and where life came from, something had to always exist. I don't think anybody's going to argue that. No matter how many theories, scientific or philosophical, something had to always exist. You can't get something out of nothing. Neither can you get the personal from the impersonal. Stars, planets, chemicals left to themselves do not have consciousness. They are not self-aware. Therefore, if something had to always exist, and if you can't get the personal from the impersonal, the something that always existed is some kind of thinking, feeling, personality. And for now, I'll make that my definition of God. I agree it doesn't necessarily lead us to the biblical God. There's all kinds of evidence for that, but that's a different debate. Some kind of thinking, feeling, personality had to always exist. Also, in order for any philosophy of life to be rational, and that's our debate today, what is irrational or irrational, we must be able to live it consistently. If the universe came into being without a creator or creators, then life is an accident. As Kevin said, we're here by randomness and chance. Now, to live consistently as an atheist, and I was an atheist for many years, I have a great respect for atheists, but to live consistently as an atheist, one must live his or her life as if their life is just an accident. They're just a shot in the dark. They're just a lot of slop that happened to accidentally evolve. The problem is we attach value to our lives. Now, what we can do is say, well, I created my own value. I'll develop my own sense of purpose. That's fine. But the moment somebody else comes along and says, my view of what our purpose is and my view of what's valuable is different from yours, then we run into a problem. And yet, we have something inside of us which tells us that we share at least one common value, and that is that in our personality, there is a conscience. The conscience is an inner commentary on how we treat human beings. It tells us that we should treat human beings with dignity and respect. You might have cultures disagree as to what dignity and respect means, but they have that in their conscience that we should treat human beings, treat each other with dignity and respect. But if life exists according to randomness and chance, human beings invented morals. There's no such thing as right or wrong. To live consistently as an atheist, then one would have to become a moral relativist. And yet many of the objections that atheists have to religion are morally based. We've heard some of them. How could a God have sat back and watched the Holocaust? Now, as somebody who's Jewish, that's a very important question to me. But we're admitting that the Holocaust is wrong. Half the people in this room, 2/3 of the people in this room I've never even met. I know that you believe the Holocaust was wrong. I know that you believe slavery was wrong. I know that you believe rape was wrong. I know you believe it was wrong for somebody to walk into an elementary school with a gun and gun people down. That's not the reaction of a moral relativist. You see, what sounds cute in the classroom has to work out in the streets. We can go into a classroom and say, well, you know, there's really no such thing as right and wrong. Hey, man, it's all relative. Then you walk outside your classroom, you discover that somebody swiped your bicycle, and what do? You cry out in moral indignation. In fact, one of the biggest objections I've ever heard from atheists and other skeptics is the hypocrisy of religion. And there is a lot of hypocrisy in religion. I'm not going to debate that religions don't have a lot of hypocrisies. Human beings, as a species, have a lot of hypocrisy. But I always like to ask my atheist friends, are you morally outraged by religious hypocrisy? And they say yes, and then I say, well, then how can that be if there's no such thing as morality? If there is no God, and I'm standing here with somebody else, and there's nobody to be the tiebreaker, there's nobody to be the judge, I could just say, as one accident to another, I have a different opinion of morality. What if I walked up to somebody on the campus and pulled a pencil out of his hand? He could say, excuse me, that's my pencil. I could say, well, it was, now it's mine. If I happen to be bigger than him, that's not going to be a problem. He says, well, what you just did was stealing. I said, yeah, it was stealing. So what? Well, stealing's wrong. Who says so? Well, everybody says so. Society says so. Well, what's society? A bunch of accidents that happen to exist according to randomness and chance as one accident to another? I have a different opinion. I'm not saying stealing's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. It just is. If somebody broke into your house and murdered one of your loved ones, would you look at them and go, well, it's one accident to another, I cannot be dogmatic here. In my opinion, what you did was wrong, but who am I to judge? It just doesn't work that way. There's a sign we used to put up out of UCSD that said, is atheism consistent? And I had a fellow walk by my table one day, and he says, I'm an atheist, and I'm very consistent. I said, well, I know you believe you are. I know you don't go to church, you think religious people are stupid or not as enlightened as you, and you don't study the Bible, you don't believe in God. So I understand in your mind you think you're being very consistent. But you are being inconsistent with the implications of God's non-existence. He said, what do you mean? I said, if God doesn't exist, you are living your life as if you are an accident. And yet you attach value to life and you share common values. And he said, he gave what's really the only thing people could give here, there's variations of it, it's commonly called the wolf pack theory, that human beings, what we're mistakenly calling morality or a conscience that comes from God, is just something that developed from society. So he took the position that whatever society decides is right. And so the reason we think it's wrong to murder and steal is that our society tells us that. And we've been brainwashed. I said, well, first of all, if a person knows he's been brainwashed, he's not brainwashed anymore. So I don't think you're as brainwashed as you think you are. But I said, let me ask you a question. So morals just came from society. So during the pre-Civil War days, when the South, the Confederate States of America, got together as a society and decided that slavery was okay, the North should have stayed out of it. They should have said, who am I to judge another culture? Now, he wanted to win the argument, so he says, well, I guess I couldn't call that wrong. I said, now look, I know that if I met you yesterday, and we weren't arguing religion and philosophy, and I merely asked you if slavery was wrong, you'd say it's wrong, you'd say it's evil, you'd say it's abhorrent. But right now you want to win an argument, so you're trying to say, well, okay, I guess to be consistent, slavery is wrong. I said, let's do an experiment. You're on your way to class? You're on your way to class? Okay. Go in there and ask your professor for just 1 minute of class time. Get up there at the podium, look your fellow students in the eye, and don't tell them you were discussing religion and philosophy. Just look them in the eye and say, I just want you to all know something about me. I do not believe that there was anything wrong with slavery in the pre-Civil War days or ancient Rome or any culture for that. I'm not saying it was right. I'm just saying it wasn't right or wrong. We should never, ever impose a morality. I said, are you willing to go into the class and say that? He stopped for a minute and then he goes, yeah. I'll go in there and say, I said, okay, I'm going to be out here with the same table tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock. If you come back and tell me you said that, I won't call you a liar. I'll take you at your word. We made an appointment. I never saw him again. I'll eat my hat if he went in and said it, because he knew slavery was wrong. But who says it's wrong? If a bunch of accidents decided it was wrong, it's merely an opinion. If we want to say that it's not an opinion, that there really is such a thing as good and evil, and our other team has acknowledged good and evil when they talk about the Holocaust, even when they try to say things about God that they don't appreciate. Well, I cannot believe in a God who would flood the world and not do anything. They're saying there's such a thing as good and evil, and if they were to believe in a deity, they would hold even the deity to that standard, let alone people. When somebody says, how can a loving God sit back and watch this suffering and evil in the world? The point is, if there were no God, there would be no such thing as evil. The moment you admit that there's such a thing as good and evil, it may be a mystery why God allows this or why God allows that. But now we have a bigger mystery. If there is no God, is good and evil not just merely an opinion? And I don't think any person in this room is going to say it's merely an opinion. Some people have. Friedrich Nietzsche did. And he wasn't too happy with his position. He developed a position called nihilism, and this idea of the Superman, where we need to just kind of make up our own values. And he even wrote in a poem that if God is dead, if there is no God, then there's no such thing as morality. He tried to be consistent. Didn't seem very happy toward the end of his life, but he did try to be consistent. How much time do I have?
You have about 50 seconds remaining.
Oh, well then I'll just sing for a moment. Okay, thank you.
We are going to go on to Team 2 for an 8-minute rebuttal.
Okay.
Sorry about that. All right,
Okay, I just briefly want to address some biology-related questions. I'll turn it over to Conway here. First of all, our opponents keep on talking about probabilities of all outcomes are equally probable, and that's ridiculous. It's like, you know, I think there are roughly 7 billion people on Earth today. I lost count, honestly. So, but you know, if you say the odds of me being here are 1 in 7 billion, you all intuitively see why that's ridiculous, because not all 7 billion people were invited to speak here tonight. You can only determine the probability of an outcome based on prior outcomes, and that's how evolution works. You're not talking about the probability of getting a human out of nothing. You're talking about the probability of getting a human from a related species. So the way creationists calculate probabilities makes absolutely no sense. Secondly, they say 8,000 species on the ark turned into over 1 million species in 4,000 years. That's a rate of evolution so rapid it would make Darwin look like a pessimist. That's insane. So if that really is what they believe, they're actually much more optimistic about evolution than I am. And in terms of this thing about, you know, oh well, we haven't seen, creationists will always do this. It's when you talk about evolution and you'll show them examples of where it's happened, they'll say, oh, that's not big enough. I want to see something bigger. Well, you know, that's what she said. But seriously, when we have seen, we've seen new genes evolve. We can look at the fossil record. We can see human ancestors, like say Homo erectus, for example, that are extinct, that no longer exist. They're similar to chimpanzees and similar to humans. There is no other way to explain what those are. And I would go on, but I'm taking up too much time already. So.
Yeah, I'll try to be a little bit faster and a little bit more lively this time, but I know I kind of dragged on a bit. But the moral argument, which is typically how this is phrased, which is what Bob is forwarding. First of all, I don't get why supernatural whatever makes things moral. I mean, I don't get that. That seems to be what he's getting at. And why is it that we consider some things moral, some things not moral, some things right, some things more moral or less moral? Even if not, good or evil. The reason why we consider some things good and some things bad is ultimately because we have certain drives, motivations, and values by virtue of the fact that we are human beings. And this is not just with humans. I mean, we see this with animals. Generally, they try to survive. They try to get food, shelter, things like that. There are basic drives. And out of those basic drives come quite a lot. In fact, a lot of where our intellect is directed is to trying to survive in the world and get by and protect those people that we do like. And there are scientific explanations for why we're social and why we do care about other people and why we have, as Bob mentioned, or at least most of us, with the exception of people with severe mental disabilities, disorders, and things like that, like psychopaths. But most of us do have this sense that, yes, we want to treat other people with respect and we want to be treated by them with respect in return. That's not surprising given the fact that human beings are almost all exactly alike. In great detail. We are not that diverse of a species. We are all very, very similar to each other, and we do have basically similar values. We do disagree to a substantial extent how we get to that point, though. And none of this requires any kind of interference from outside to say, oh, something is really, really, really wrong, in the ultimate, absolute, beyond all, dispute sense. There's nothing within that. Yes, you can arbitrarily come up with a rule and say, you simply call it moral. That's typically not what people are talking about when they develop ethical systems, though. When they develop ethics, they're trying to get at an account of just what morality is. And after they get an account of what morality is, and people dispute this, philosophers, social scientists and so forth, they dispute just what morality consists of, or even if the concept is just too vague. And we're talking about something much more detailed and much more deeper in our species than simply saying that things are right and wrong. Yes, we can say that things like the Holocaust and natural disasters and horrific happenings to people, we can say that they're wrong. What is it that we mean when we say that these things are wrong? We say these things are wrong because they hurt other people, because other people are damaged by these things. And even those people who aren't directly affected by this, even when they become aware that other people have been hurt, often feel themselves very, very bad. They can put themselves into other people's shoes. They have a sense of empathy. And you don't need any kind of spirit, energy, whatever, existing beyond the physical necessarily to account for the fact that we do have empathy for other human beings. And I could go on this, but basically what Bob's arguing for is something tacked on to what we call morality, something that's completely superfluous and adds absolutely nothing whatsoever to the concept.
With all due respect to Bob Siegel, I just want to say that nonsense, however loudly and passionately spouted, is still nonsense. The evidence from cultural anthropology shows clearly that, in fact, morality is culturally determined. And I'm going to just read you, this is just one small example of the kind of thing that we in our culture would find abhorrent. Imagine the parents who send their adolescent son to stay with his godfather, where he is made very welcome and becomes part of the new family for a while. During this time, his godfather becomes physically involved with him, culminating with the boy being deliberately ejaculated upon. The parents are so delighted about this that they insist on giving the man joints of meat. Surely a more appropriate strategy would be to call in the police and child protection workers or beat the living daylights out of this man. But this social arrangement can be found in Papua New Guinea. There are multiple evidences that different times, different cultures have seen different acts as being right and other acts as being wrong. We have the example most recently, very recently in Pakistan, of the little girl who was shot in the head because she believed that women should be educated. Well, clearly the Taliban thought this was not only wrong, it was wrong to the extent of being a capital offense. And they attempted to take her out. But history is replete with changes in the way people view things. In the state in which I was born, Kentucky, and I'm not going to tell how long ago that was, but at one time the age of consent was 12. It is no longer 12. It has changed. It has, if you want to say this, it has evolved. There is no objective morality. And I have no problem with that because I'm aware that the standards that I use to try to determine how I'm going to behave, if I violate them, I'm going to likely be in a world of hurt. And it won't be after I die. It will be right here and right now. If I have sexual congress with an underage child and I'm caught, they won't be able to build a hole deep enough to put me in. And I don't want that. So that's one of the things that certainly I would keep in mind if I were in the position of feeling tempted to engage in one of these behaviors. Certainly, man lives in groups, and there are some things that every group, I think, has found expedient. For instance, you don't kill members of your own group. However, there are many cultures in which it's absolutely okay to go kill members of other groups, like some of the headhunting tribes of the Amazon. Where at a certain age a boy is expected to go to another building. I'm out of time. Almost. 10 seconds. You can stop now. Okay.
We're finished with this side. Okay. We're going to go ahead to Team 1's 8-minute rebuttal.
When we use an example like the Taliban, why would the Taliban believe that it's okay to go and shoot a woman? Because they have a theology. They have a belief. And I acknowledge that different cultures superimpose their own understandings. What I mentioned was that we have in our conscience a value that says we should treat other people with dignity and respect. Culture to culture, that changes. And I acknowledge that right from the beginning. So absolutely nothing was refuted here. You could go to certain Arabic cultures, and it's considered polite to belch in the middle of your meal. In America, that would be considered impolite. But what's interesting is that both cultures agree that you should be polite, that you should treat your guests with respect. There's a culture, the Inuit Eskimo. At least at one time, it was very common if a wayfaring stranger came by that the man would let him sleep with his wife. That was their way of showing respect. In America, we wouldn't do that. So we're talking about one value, treat other people with respect. Now, they acknowledge that there can be such a thing as saying, well, we're not going to recognize the humanity of those other people. How did Adolf Hitler manage to create an idealism where people were actually pushing Jews into ovens and gas chambers? Because they taught that Jews were subhuman. They taught that Jews were devils. How is it that at one time in our country we had this shameful practice called slavery? Because people were teaching that African Americans were subhuman and therefore not entitled to the same. Why did they do that? Because they knew the minute they admitted that we're talking about human beings, just as human as everybody else, that we know what's right and we know what's wrong and we know what we need to do. By the way, it's not true that most human beings have empathy. History has shown us war, crime, bloodshed, racism. We could go on and on. Human beings are a mixture. There are times we have empathy. There are times we say, look out for number one. We don't do a very good job of following this conscience. The fact that we don't do a very good job of following it is one of the greatest arguments that it comes from something outside of ourselves. Because if we were going to invent morals, wouldn't we invent something we could live up to easier? We have a tendency to be selfish, but we have a little voice inside of us telling us not to be selfish. Where does that come from? Now, it was suggested that it's unnecessary to impose something supernatural. Let's get this cleared up about what's supernatural or isn't supernatural. Our opponents don't believe in God. Okay, I respect that. So any discussion about God, they're calling supernatural. But hypothetically, if there is a God, he's not supernatural. He's as natural as anything else that exists. They talk about fanciful miracles and supernatural explanations. What is a miracle? It is something we don't understand. The Bible doesn't teach that when God did miracles, he was Mandrake the magician waving a magic wand. If somebody living in the first century could look into the future and see you with your iPad or watching television or watch an airplane, it would look miraculous to them. We understand that we've harnessed science that they had not harnessed yet. If human beings survive and are around 1,000 years from now, don't we just assume that they'll do things that would absolutely blow our minds? Of course we do. But we assume they'll do it according to some kind of science. Now I want to get back to a little bit of some of the things that they were talking about with the flood, young earth, old earth, evolution. I believe this is a rabbit trail. And that it's very unnecessary. First of all, it's not the topic of this debate. We're just talking about some kind of theism. One of our opponents already admitted that you can show the rationale of theism, and it's not necessarily talking about the Bible. I find it interesting that our opponents like to go to the Bible. So let's go there for a moment. There are many Christians who do not believe in a young earth. There are many Christians who do not believe in a literal six-day creation. Now, my colleagues here, I have a great respect for them, and they have many compelling arguments for a young earth, and I think we should hear what they are. But if that's hanging you up, let me tell you something. One can read Genesis chapter 1 and not necessarily take it literally. Now that doesn't mean you can do that with all Scripture. Scripture is a variety of different kinds of writing. Genesis 1 was written in a style of writing known as Hebrew poetry. It's very similar to the Psalms in its structure. Genesis is not seeking to tell us what process God used to create the world or how old the world is. If you keep reading the rest of Genesis, you see that. They rush through the creation of the world, they rush through the fall of man, the sin, the Tower of Babel, the flood, and only when they get to Abraham does the writer crank it down and talk in intimate detail. And suddenly we're hearing about Abraham's donkey and his barley and his sex life. That tells you something about the priority of the writer. The writer was quickly reviewing a few oral understandings, oral traditions, and didn't spend the time. I wish they'd spent more time talking about how God created the world. I'd gladly trade 20 chapters of Leviticus for more information about how God created the world. But that was not the priority of the author. Therefore, Genesis leaves room for an older earth. It leaves room for the theory of evolution, or a better theory. I personally would put my emphasis on or a better theory. But let's say you're an evolutionist. As acknowledged again by the other team, there are many theistic evolutionists. Simply saying that things evolve from a lower order to a higher order, that doesn't solve anything. it doesn't look that much different from miracles if you think about it. Remember, they always love to call the Christianity fairy tales. Remember the fairy tale, the frog becoming a handsome prince? You give a frog to an evolutionist in a couple of billion years, he'll become a handsome prince too. He'll become a human being. I talked to an evolutionist one time. I said, do you believe in evolution by randomness and chance, or do you believe in theistic evolution? He said, randomness and chance. I said, okay. And then let me ask you a question. How do you account for the complexity of our universe? He gave me an answer I'll never forget. He goes, listen, it took billions and billions and billions of years. It only makes sense that things finally turn out right. I said, what do you mean right? If there is no God, there is no right, and there is no wrong. What is, just is. One of our opponents talked about the fact that we may have the ability to someday assemble life. Okay, but then that begs the bigger question of who or what assembled our life.
How much time?
Yeah, well, about 90 seconds.
Yeah. I just like to talk about something from the beginning of the argument, which was like 30 minutes ago. But we heard, okay, so it was insinuated that like every single person on the Descent from Darwin list has some bad personal reason for disagreeing with Darwin, even though they have a doctorate from a major university. I don't know. I'd just like to point out that that's a pretty bold claim to make for a bunch of people you don't know who have doctors. I don't know. You can't really know that every single person on the list doesn't have good reasons for what they believe. And considering that they're extremely qualified, and if you're just going to shut them down in advance, or poison the well, as they say, that doesn't really seem like an open scientific mind about someone who's willing to hear objections to their theory. Yeah, I just wanted to point that out. Because considering, if you say that nobody disagrees with this, then you see a list of hundreds of qualified people who disagree with it, and then you write them all off instantly. I don't know. I think you're not really being fair at that point. I don't know. I guess that's all for now.
Okay, we are going to go to closing statements. They are going to proceed in the same order as the opening statements. And after that, there will be an opportunity for audience questions or comments to be directed to either of the teams. The closing statements are 5 minutes each. Team 1 will begin.
Hello. Okay, I'm just going to wrap it up here with, there'll be a few more things, but basically just wrap it up. Again, I want to look at this guy. I think he's a great example. 50 years as an atheist, reconsiders, decides it is more rational to be a deist. Okay, and again, why would he do such a thing? Regardless of the probability, by the way, there are limits to the known size of the universe. Cosmologists estimate that the universe has an end. They also estimate the time span of the universe, 15 to 20 billion years. Okay, so that's known. That's not debated among atheists or Christians. That's a fact. Now, there are some things, though, that regardless have a zero probability, but atheism predicts they would happen anyway in direct contradiction to known scientific laws. What do I mean by that? The law of causality. Every event with a beginning must have a cause. Einstein postulated originally that there was no beginning to the universe. He ended up being proven wrong by himself. Now, he denied his own mathematical theorems because he was so convinced by the scientism of his day that he made this huge blunder. He said much later, when I was discussing cosmological problems with Einstein, George Gerow said this, he remarked that the introduction of the cosmological term was the biggest blunder of his life. That was, he tried to stay with the paradigm of the day, which was an eternal universe, and instead of listening to his science, his math, what he ended up doing was bending to the philosophy of an eternal or steady-state universe. It was proved later on by these fellows here that the universe actually had a beginning. If you were to go through history and look at that, I won't spend any time on that. 4 laws of thermodynamics are up here. The first and second law, if you combine the laws, is the total energy content of the universe is constant, and the total entropy, the most usable energy heat, is constantly increasing. What this is saying is that eventually, over time, we will have what they call a heat death to the universe. The universe is slowly winding down. This is entropy. Regarding God, people often bring up, oh, then who made God? Every event with a beginning must have a cause, So what about God? What caused God? If God is eternal, he doesn't need a cause. There is no logical fallacy in believing this. Now, the only reason atheists always say, hey, that's a cop-out, it's not a cop-out because in the early 1900s, all evolutionists believed that the universe was eternal and therefore didn't need a cause, and that's how they justified it. I'm simply using the same logic that they used. And the Bible actually predicts this. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Psalm 102, 25 to 27, in the beginning you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens and the work are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like clothing, you will change them, and they will be discarded. But you remain the same, and your years will never end. Interestingly, this all jives with science. There was a beginning, just like Einstein proved. The universe is actually wearing out and running down, just like the first and second law of thermodynamics predict. God is eternal, which is exactly what's required to have a universe. By the way, we do know what is living and non-living. Okay, I can tell a rock is not alive. There is a biological criteria for that, and that is metabolism, growth, reproduction, and reaction to stimuli. So, James, with all respect, biological textbooks have taught for years that certain things are alive and certain things are not. A rock is not alive. Atheism contradicts the law of biogenesis. Again, why do I believe it's more rational to believe in God than not to believe in God? Because atheism specifically contradicts the law of biogenesis in that something can spontaneously generate when in fact all known science shows that it cannot spontaneously generate. That is impossible. Romans 1:20, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. We also have a real old book written by people who lived a long time ago and who recorded events from their lives and those around them, testifying to what really happened in the past. My studies of the book lead me to believe they are telling the truth. Why is this significant? Why is this one of the reasons that I believe it's more rational to believe in God than not? Because today we simply speculate about the past, but there are people who were actually there and recorded what happened in the past. I believe that their testimony about what happened in the past is more trustworthy than people that live today and theorize and speculate and guess and have to constantly change what happened in the past. To summarize, the probability of the integrated complexity of life coming into existence is not rational without an intelligent designer. The probability is so infinitesimally small, there is no way you can have our universe without a designer, without a God. Time does not solve the scientific problems inherent to atheism. Atheism stands in direct contradiction to many other scientific laws, and we have a historically reliable book that claims God exists and that it created everything. And the moral argument. Which
okay, and now we're going to go to the final closing statement. Team 2 has it. It's going to be a 5-minute closing statement.
Okay, throughout this discussion, we have presented what we consider to be evidence that events in the world can be accounted for without positing the existence of supernatural forces, that some events in the world are not what we would expect to see if indeed a deity with all the aforementioned qualities, that are, omniscience, omnibenevolence, compassion, truly existed and were involved in its management. And some other events that we would expect to see with such a deity directly involved are conspicuous by their absence. Therefore, we conclude that the hypothesis that a deity or deities has or have a real existence must be rejected. Our position can be succinctly summed up in a quote attributed to Epicurus. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? I will close by saying that when I am asked if I believe in God, I answer, yes, absolutely. But only in the same sense as I believe in Sherlock Holmes, Winnie the Pooh, the Incredible Hulk, the Fantastic Four, and other less lofty products of the human imagination.
Does that conclude your closing statement? Okay, we have an opportunity for audience participation. I've been informed that comments as such or speeches are not allowed, but questions can be posed to either side. So I'll call on people in the order I see hands raised, I suppose. Go ahead.
I have a question in regards to the descent from Darwin. Have you guys ever heard of the Steve Project, which was a massive listing of scientists just with the name Steve only, or Stephanie, that agree completely with it, because the descent from Darwin was only about 500 scientists or so, and then the other one reached up to somewhere around like 2,000 just with the name Steve alone. I was just wondering if you ever heard of that.
I have heard of that.
Okay.
As far as I know, I'm not sure if that. I'd be happy for somebody to forward that to me, because I wasn't sure that that was legitimate or not. Also, it is 2,000 scientists, and I just do want to be clear that I don't want to argue. I'm not arguing that the majority of people decides what is true. That would be a logical fallacy, and I know that. 85% of America believes in God, so I could use that as a statistic. That, hey, see, God's real. But I understand what your point. You know, yeah.
Can I just add to that quickly? I do want to mention two scientists, though, because I think they're respected in this room. One is Charles Darwin. Darwin did not set out to disprove God. Darwin had gone to divinity school at one time in his life. Now, it is true that late in his life, he became more of an agnostic, but that was because of the death of his daughter. He did not claim that his own theories were causing him to dismiss the existence of God. And Albert Einstein, certainly not a Christian, certainly not a believer in the Bible, but here's a quote from Albert Einstein. Everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which we, with our modest powers, must feel humble.
Yeah, hi. I've forgotten your name. Sure. Kevin. Hi, Kevin. I'm really troubled by a lot of the illogical and just things that just don't make sense that have been said on this panel. Okay. I think that a lot of you guys started missing the first beat, which was what is God, because you're talking apples and oranges. But you mentioned truth, and you're saying that we should quote unquote believe the Bible if you know your slide was correct. But I'm trying to figure out what makes you think that people who were alive a few thousand years ago, living in the desert, with no formal education, no room for it, no time for it, and no background, would have known how the universe or the world began. They couldn't know, they didn't know. I don't know if you're arguing enlightenment, and that's how they came to this quote-unquote truth or knowledge, but if they couldn't and didn't know, and they had no learned and provable and experiential data with which to work, what makes you think that that would be the truth?
Okay, let's allow Kevin to answer that. Go ahead.
I would say that actually they were learned. If you read Solomon, okay, he gives again, the Bible is not a science book, but when it talks about science, it's accurate. He talks about the movement of the water, okay? He talks about, for example, the evaporation taking place and all that, the water going up into the heavens, coming down. He talks about all of that kind of thing. Yeah, sure.
But they weren't building skyscrapers, they weren't building aqueducts, and they weren't like making iPads. They didn't have the kind of knowledge that we have at this point.
Okay, and we don't want to turn the question period into an argumentation period. So,
yeah,
do you want to respond to what the young
yeah, I would just say that just because somebody's not building skyscrapers doesn't mean they're stupid and that they can't comprehend what's going on around them. You know, they had language. You look at the Egyptians who built the pyramids. That's something we have puzzled about for a very long time. And so the reality is that
or the building of the world.
Okay, well that's direct revelation.
Give me more than that, a lot more than that.
Okay.
Let's be clear. Evolutionists weren't here at the beginning of the universe either. The people that wrote the Bible didn't claim they were here at the beginning of the universe. They didn't claim that they witnessed the beginning of the universe. They claimed what you suggested, that they were enlightened. They claimed that God spoke to them. Now, I know how to speak. So if there's a God, I said if, for those of you that are down, if there's a God, he would know how to speak too. And if he's been speaking, you'd expect that he would have spoken generation after generation, and we would expect a series of documentations and for it to have left an imprint upon history, and that's exactly what we have in the Bible, which is not one book. It's a collection of 66 different documents written over a period of some 2,000 years, generation after generation by people who either heard from God or witnessed divine activity.
Okay, Conway, you wanted in on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question about what was the thing. You know,
all this enlightenment in the Bible, and against that I will offer one thing that seems clearly unenlightened, and that is the inference to be drawn that from passages in the Bible that the value of pi is 3.0. In the passages in which they're talking about the temple, a pool at the Temple of Solomon, they mention that the circumference of the pool is 30 cubits. The diameter is 10. 10 into 30 is 3. The value of pi is not 3, nor is there any wiggle room in there. They don't say, well, it's sort of 3, or it could be 3. It is just simply 3. This is conspicuously wrong.
Okay, I saw a hand back
Can
here.
we respond to your responses?
Yeah, quick response.
I just want to be clear that there are things like this in the Bible where somebody will say, oh, look at, the Bible talks about sunrise, and therefore it's unscientific because everybody knows the sun is not actually rising. The reality is that they're able to speak in these terms just like we're able to speak in these terms. When I go down to Sunset Cliffs, I don't say, oh, look, the Earth's rotating, there's the sun, okay? No, I say there's the sunrise, or there's the sunset. And also, just because you're not exactly precise, also keep in mind, this doesn't automatically mean you're not accurate. If I say, hey, I'm 36 years old, and somebody says, oh, you liar, you're 36, 3 months, and 3 days, okay? Just because I wasn't exactly precise doesn't mean I was lying, okay? I can say the distance to my house is 20 miles. It doesn't mean I'm lying because I didn't give it down to feet, you know? So there are all kinds of things like this in the Bible where people try to nail the Bible on, oh, look at, pi or whatever, and because they claimed it was a circle, or, I think that is not a very compelling argument against the Bible.
I thought I saw a hand back over here. Was there one?
Well, yeah, I
Go
just
ahead.
wanted the other side to address, do you know of any other scientific errors within the Bible?
As the other side admitted, there's very little science in the Bible. I mean, it's a lot of vagary, and it's a lot of, I mean, these people were ignorant. They were writing down, half-formed myths and legends, half-baked ideas. I mean, they didn't know much about anything. As far as human civilizations go, even during the time, they weren't all that advanced. Did you have?
Sure, I can answer that, yeah. I mean, I would say, again, there really isn't any science in the Bible that I'm aware of that is really relevant here. But I think, that's kind of aside from the point, because the Bible is, as the other side pointed out, it's not a science textbook. It wasn't meant to be. The question of whether it's valid or not is entirely separate from that. And I would point out that there are lots of things in the Bible that, aside from science, are crazy from a modern perspective. If you read through Deuteronomy, for example, you can find all kinds of things. I mean, I think there's a prohibition on wearing garments that are made from more than one kind of cloth. Which polyester and cotton, right there, you're going to hell. I mean, that's not good. Yeah, and then of course, all the things about, when you can and cannot sell people as slaves, and what you can and cannot do with your daughter and children and so forth. There's a lot of very weird stuff in the Old Testament. So aside from I would say there's not really any science in there that I can think of that's actually accurate and useful. But, again, it's not a science textbook. The point I would make is that it's invalid aside from that for many reasons.
Let me respond to that. Yeah, let me respond quickly. Like we said, the Bible's not a science book, but the Bible is corroborated by other history. The Bible is corroborated by a lot of archaeology. And this thing from Deuteronomy, and I hear this all the time, well, the Bible promotes slavery. Utter nonsense. In the New Testament, slavery is condemned in 3 different places. Galatians chapter 3, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, 1 Timothy chapter 1. In the Old Testament days, there were 2 kinds of slavery. Either these were prisoners of war, nations that Israel got into war with, or they were people that actually sold themselves in indentured servanthood. And then God in his mercy said every 7 years you're to let those slaves go. As for some of the bizarre laws about wearing different garments, we're finding more and more through archaeology that this had to do with God not wanting the Israelites to imitate the way other nations worshipped. Other nations were taking babies and offering them on the altar to the Baals and the gods of fertility. And we were finding out that a lot of things that look kind of bizarre to us, they were just too similar to the way in which some of those other religions were manifested.
Okay, can did you?
I had one more thing to add to that.
If you
Okay,
can,
another thing regarding science. All the Levitical laws in the Old Testament, if you really look into them, you'll find that a lot of them make a lot of sense for their day and age. What we're not used to is because of our culture. If you look at the laws of cleaning, you know the Israelites were very rare in that they actually washed their hands. To us, this is everyday stuff. But it wasn't until the 1700s that this was actually proven to be valuable. It was by a doctor named Semmelweis in France. And he was finding that people were Germany, were dealing with dead bodies, and then moving on and into the maternity ward and giving birth. And so they ended up, the kids were dying before they were born, and the moms too. So this was all the way back in the Levitical laws. They also have laws against fungus in houses. Okay, now today, if you ever get into a law about black mold in houses, it's huge. It's such an issue in our houses because black mold can kill you and it spreads inside the walls. Well, they actually have laws against mold in houses, and they're very detailed. It's actually destroy the house if this mold doesn't go away. If you take some time and do the research, you'll find that these laws aren't as bizarre as you think. Like handling pigskin, a lot of people always joke, oh, we're playing football, we're sinners, we're going to hell. Pigs often carried disease. They couldn't play with pigskin because it would kill them. Okay, back then you couldn't go and get antibiotics from your local doctor. You had to be very careful about touching dead things and playing with anything that was deceased. This was the whole rules about unclean and being clean. Why it was so important that you not touch dead bodies, because you could wipe out an entire community if you were not careful. They didn't have medicine like we do today.
Okay, this gentleman has his hand up, and then over here will be next.
Hi, I just have a question. I'm not a biblical scholar, and unfortunately I can't cite chapter and verse, but I believe that Jesus is known for saying that if you're attacked, you should turn the other cheek. But there's also somewhere in the New Testament where he clearly states he's in favor of slavery, and that even beating your slaves is okay under certain circumstances. How do you reconcile those inconsistencies with Jesus' own...
Yeah, it's very easy to reconcile because Jesus never said anything of the kind. Now, he told some parables. He told some parables where there was some violence. Nowhere in any of Jesus' didactic teaching, nowhere in the Sermon on the Mount, did he ever condone slavery or tell people to go out and beat people. As for turn the other cheek, though, one can ask the question, was Jesus trying to teach some kind of pacifism? And that's not true either, because as you know, in the Old Testament, they did have wars, and Jesus will be coming as a warrior at his second coming, he claims. But in those days, striking somebody on the cheek amongst the ancient rabbis, that was a way of insulting somebody. Jesus wasn't saying if somebody hits you on the cheek, you got to stand there and let him beat your brains out. He's saying do not repay insult for insult.
This says, Jesus said specifically, slaves, obey your earthly masters with deep respect and fear. Serve them sincerely as you would serve Christ. Ephesians 6:5.
Okay, you're reading from the Apostle Paul. And Paul and the Apostles, the same Apostle Paul, when I mentioned that slavery was condemned in 3 different places, it was from the writings of the Apostle Paul where it was condemned. The same apostle condemns it. In those days, there were more slaves in Rome than citizens. If the apostles had told the slaves to have an uprising, Christianity would have been a bloodbath. That's why when they asked Jesus, should we pay taxes to the Romans? If he had said, don't pay taxes to the Romans, there was a whole organization there in Israel called the Zealots who wanted to see Jesus come to their side and overthrow the Romans. But he said, give Caesar what is Caesar, give God what is God's. Temporarily, they said, we're not going to support a violent revolution, but there was a way to peacefully free a slave. And Paul, when he told the slaves to obey your masters, he also said, however, if you have an opportunity to gain your freedom, take it. And then there was a person named Philemon who had a slave named Onesimus. And Onesimus escaped from him. Paul paid his expenses to go back and told Philemon that he should let that slave go. So we've got to look at the Bible in its context. If you take the Bible or any piece of literature out of context, you can make it say anything. You were quoting from Paul, not Jesus, the same Paul who condemned slavery in 3 different places, but no, he was not going to let slavery turn into a violent revolution.
Okay, this gentleman had his hand up, and then you're going to be next. Go ahead.
Kevin, could you clear up a contradiction, it seems, in what you were saying?
Sure.
At several points you said that eternity doesn't make any sense scientifically. You said, appealing to science, you said that the universe has a beginning. And you also said that God is part of nature. And then you went on to say that God is eternal. please clear up that contradiction.
Okay, I didn't say God is a part of nature. I'm not sure where that came from, but
Yes, you did.
Bob said that.
No,
I'm sorry.
I said if God exists, he's something very natural. And
Okay, that's nature.
Okay,
I
so
don't mean but that doesn't mean he's trees and planets. It means he's something
He's
else.
nature.
He's not nature. He's
Oh,
something
he's
else.
not nature.
He's an
Okay.
entity that exists naturally.
okay, so my only argument was that the universe is not eternal. This is scientifically proven. We know it through the second law of thermodynamics. We know that things are slowing down and that entropy is increasing. Okay, this is part of the reason that this conclusion has been made. And you don't need to talk to a Christian to verify that. Talk to any atheist cosmologist. I guarantee you they're going to tell most of the scientific evidence today presents that there is a beginning to the universe. And the Bible teaches that God is eternal, and that is necessary if he's going to be able to create the universe. You have to have something that has always existed that's able to start the beginning of the universe. So as far as God being natural or supernatural, you could get into a lot of different discussions about what that is, but hopefully that at least I have no argument about it.
This was my way of saying if God exists, he's real. That's what I was saying, because it was speculated that when we go from the conscience to possess something supernatural, the minute people hear the word supernatural, they equate it with something unreal. I'm just saying if there is a God, then he really exists. Now, whether we call that natural, I don't mean that some pantheistic view of God, that God is the trees, God is the flowers. That's not what I was saying.
James said he wanted to dovetail on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, just really quick. This is what I'm talking about. We haven't even clearly defined just what God is. God is something that's natural, but he's not anything natural like we know he is, but he's something natural, but no further elaboration on what that. I mean, you gotta at least give me something. I mean,
I gave you something. I said he was a thinking, feeling, sentient being.
I think you're up, right? Did you have another comment?
Yeah, just one quick.
a thinking, feeling, sentient being, so like a human being. I mean, like, what does this mean? I mean, you haven't really defined sentient in any specific...
I said, for the sake of this discussion, does it make rational sense to believe that there is some kind of eternal personality? Now, if we want to get more specific in the Bible's definition of God, I think that's another debate. You guys like? I'd love to.
No, I wasn't mentioning the Bible's version of God. I was just trying to get to any kind of coherent whatever. I mean, yeah.
The coherence of this debate was: does it make rational sense to believe in some kind of thinking, feeling, sentient being, or not? That's as far as we're going with God in this debate. Unless you want to get into the Bible, then we have much more specifics about who God is.
Okay, we'll move on, but still, we haven't clearly defined it, so we don't know what we're talking about.
Okay,
I mean,
you know what? As moderator, I'm going to choose to move on. I think we've kind of belabored that point. This gentleman was up.
Yeah, I think I remember Hugh Ross saying that the scientific method was derived by Bacon from the Bible. Is that correct?
Directed to this time.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I cannot answer that. I don't know the answer to that question.
This gentleman and there's a young man over here. Go ahead. We have to wrap up at 6, so I'd like to caution the audience and the participants, our team members, to try to keep it succinct so we can get more participation. Go ahead.
This side, could you respond to the idea that abiogenesis is an impossibility?
That's actually a very interesting question. We didn't get a chance to talk about it in great detail, and we probably could. Abiogenesis, people tend to confuse that a lot with evolution. Evolution is about what happens once you have life. Evolution is what happens, is how one species turns into many species. That has nothing to do with abiogenesis, which is where the first life form originally came from. In terms of how that happened, we don't actually know, to be completely honest. Because one of the problems with trying to investigate that is that there are no fossils for that time period. You have no fossils for what was, prior to when we had life, obviously. So that's very difficult to investigate. You can try to design experiments in labs where you try to replicate conditions that you had on early Earth and see what you get. And we've had some success with that. For example, I'm sure you've all heard of the experiment where the investigators took a mixture of chemicals similar to what you would probably find on the early Earth, passed an electric current through that, and you get a mixture of amino acids. And through those and other experiments, we've shown that the building blocks that you would have needed to make life would have been common on the early Earth. How exactly that came together to make the first life form is something that's still in debate. But you know, this is how we solve problems in science. When we don't know how something happened, we do an experiment. You know, religious people on the other hand will just wave their hands and say, oh, God did it. And that's called God of the gaps thinking. And that's been refuted time and time again. And that was what we did before we had science. You know, back before we had science, if we wanted to know why there was a rainstorm, we would say, oh, God did it. If we wanted to know why there was a plague, we would say, oh, God did it. You know, in the Bible, you have stories where there's a plague in Israel, and so, you know, the writer will say that, you know, God did this because David took a census by head instead of, I forget the full story, but David took a census, he wasn't supposed to do that, so God sends a plague and kills some Israelites. And that's typical God of the gaps type thinking. That's not how we do things in science. In science, you do an experiment to figure out why something happens the way it does. And, you know, that's something that's being worked on, is how abiogenesis happened. So it's an interesting problem. And I could go on much greater length, but I should probably shut up at this point.
I've seen there are now 5 hands that are up. We'll try to get to as many of those people as we can. This young man was next, and then I'm going to go to this gentleman, and then you, and we'll see who else we can get here.
This is for the Christian side. I know you talked about, for the more argument, that without a God, morality is relative. But why can't you believe in an objective moral system that's non-foundationalist, or that the propositions are just, things are just true or false?
Well, you're asking a very good question, and it has a good answer. The answer is that if there is no God, we are here by randomness and chance, our opinions of morality are only opinions. I've never met you. I don't believe you're of the opinion that slavery is wrong. I believe you know it's wrong. I believe you know rape is wrong. If there's no God, and you wanted to be consistent, you'd have to say, well, that's just an opinion. And if society were to change its opinion, that's okay. And that's the problem. And now, if it's hypothetically possible, is it possible that people just made up morals? Yes, but it's possible. Anything's possible, but not everything's probable. Not everything's rational. Thus, the subject matter and thesis behind this debate.
Okay.
The source of morality
Sir, could you speak up a little bit so everyone can hear you?
Let's see. Bob claimed that God is the source of morality, and Kevin claimed in his closing statement that the Bible had 2 stories about God. So in the Bible, there's the story of the Israelites and the Midianites, and there was God commanded the Israelites to kill the male Midianite children, but keep the females that had not known man by laying with him, or quote, for yourselves. Like, what was going on there? Sorry, I'm going to take it.
What's going on there is that there are different kinds of writing, and then the ancient Hebrews spoke with great hyperbole. And that was hyperbole that God was using. Okay, now wait. I want you to all catch this. We have a guy who wanted to refute the moral argument by talking about how important it is to study different cultures and different anthropology. And all I'm doing is talking about what was a custom in the culture, and he throws it out because it's not convenient to his argument.
No,
it is a fact that there is hyperbole in the Bible. For example, when God told the Israelites to go into Canaan, they had this statement, kill everybody, men and women, Then you go to the time of Solomon, many years later, and we find that that had not been done. Those peoples were still alive, and yet when Joshua went into the promised land at the end, he said everything God told him to do, he did. So he did not understand that command as needing to go there and commit a genocide.
Kevin, very briefly.
Okay, my answer is very brief. I don't know the answer to that question, but I can promise you I'll look it up. I don't agree, and we don't always agree, I don't agree with his response to that question, but I do believe there's an answer to the question. And if you can jot that down, I will take the time to look into it and check it out. But I don't, again, I believe most likely the answer that I'm going to find is that there's something going on there that we don't know about. But you have to look into the cultural answers. It's the same thing. My guess is it's the same thing that happens with the pigskin, with the other cultural. I'll give you. He claimed the 2 different cloths. Okay, I've heard a response to that question about the two different materials being sewn together is that if they were to shrink, it will tear. And because they have scarcity of resources, it's very important that they have as much as they can, that they watch out for themselves and really keep it. Here we go down to Vaughn's, get whatever I need. You know, I go down to Target, no big deal. Out there, there's no Target, there's no Vaughn's, there's nothing. They have to be very careful about the resources they have. If it doesn't rain for 3 years, they don't have any water. They don't have running water. They don't have anything. And I think when we put ourselves in their culture, you have to also keep in mind that their neighbors, for example, some of their neighbors who believed in Molech would actually sacrifice their babies to Molech, to the god of Molech. They also, if you'll notice in the Levitical laws, there's laws against having sex with animals. Okay, we don't live around anybody that we know, hopefully you don't, that is struggling with having sex with animals. And so the things that they had to deal with are a lot different than what we have to deal with today. And I think if you look into the psychology, you look into the psychology of cultures and societies, and you really reflect on it, I think you're going to find that if the answer is not satisfying to you, it makes more sense than you actually think it does, and it's not as stupid as you think you think it is. But I'll be happy to do some research and look into that and get back to you on that.
Okay, I know that 4 people have raised their hands. You're up next. 2 young ladies over there. There's a gentleman there, and hopefully we'll get to them. So again, if you can keep it succinct, go ahead.
Okay, so a question to you guys. He talked about morality existing because of a God, and you said that there doesn't need to be a God. But when you quoted the example of society determines that morality, you quoted things like the Taliban or certain things. But so maybe you did clarify. I just want clarification. At what point do we step in? When do we get to look at another culture and say, "Whoa, wait, that is wrong"? Because we kind of do look at other people and say that their actions are wrong. But if their society accepts that, then, like he said, that's not really wrong.
Let me just say something really briefly, then I'll pass it. Sorry. This is something where we disagree, because I know you believe all morality is relative. I actually believe that there is an objective morality, and I think you can base that on logic and reason. I don't think you need to invoke a higher power to do that. I think, again, Christians and creationists often like to say, well, if life is just chemicals, and if life is just chemicals, then why does anything matter? And that to me is a strange argument. It's as if you said, well, Notre Dame Cathedral is just a bunch of bricks, so why is it important? Well, because it's beautiful. Something doesn't have to have some sort of higher spiritual dimension to be interesting or important or valuable. I'm sorry.
How do you know it's beautiful?
Yeah, would you repeat your question, because I've forgotten what it was?
Okay, sorry. If he said that morality is determined because there's a higher, because we have God, and you said, but it's defined by society.
Right.
But if societies differ, and one culture does something that to us is like a heinous act, how can we ever step in and condemn that if their society determines that that is okay?
Because if we are, basically, I think it boils down to which culture has the power to enforce its idea of morality. Basically. So insofar as, we've had this problem in this country. Let's take something like female genital mutilation, which in this country will get you prosecuted for child abuse. However, I don't see us going into places in North Africa and other areas where this practice is relatively common, and that we believe strongly. The fact that we feel something, we strongly feel that something is wrong, is not evidence that it is wrong in all circumstances, in all times, in all cultures. All it means is that we at this point believe this is wrong. And clearly there was a time when it was not believed that slavery was wrong. And we had a civil war about that. And the side that prevailed was the side that believed that slavery was wrong. If the South had prevailed, we might be looking at an entirely different kind of world. But I don't think you have to have objective morality to have an idea of how you're going to run your life. It might influence how you feel you should intervene in other people's lives, but not how you're running your own life. But but I agree. I mean, I believe that, for instance, female genital mutilation, it's a hard thing. However, had I been raised in Somalia and I had a daughter, I might very well be saying, yeah, it's time for her to undergo this procedure, and think that it was remiss of me to block it in any way.
Okay, and you wanted to add to that?
Okay, so I want to respond to Jonathan really quick, who was talking about beauty as kind of an example of morality, because they're both values. So he used the example of Notre Dame Cathedral, and he said it's just a bunch of bricks. So why do we care about that bunch of bricks? It's because it's beautiful. But why do we think it's beautiful? It's because we are subjects, we're personalities, we have minds, and we ascribe the beauty to it. If the human race was wiped out, I don't think that, like, the ants would say that Notre Dame Cathedral is beautiful. Like, they're not ascribing that value to it. So the source of the beauty is our judgment. And it's kind of the same problem with morality. We see that beauty as subjective because it's just coming from us. It's not coming from anywhere above. And if someone else said, no, the cathedral's ugly, we can't prove them wrong. But the point is that it's subjective. It comes from humans. And if that's all that morality is too, then we could just disagree on that. And then kind of like it seems... Oh, wait. Okay.
I want to say something quick before it's 6 o'clock, so we're going to let people go. But
Did we agree we were going to try to continue this to 6:15?
we can continue it till 6:15, but if I want to catch people before everybody starts leaving. So I'm looking for atheists who used to be Christians. Okay, I'm actually making a short video clip on why some Christians become atheists. If you're interested in it, please contact me. There's a little sign-up sheet in the back if you're interested to know more about it. It's just to get a better education about that. And also, for anybody who's interested, starting January 13th, I teach classes online, meaning they're live online in-person classes. If it's 20 hours of evidence for God, and if you don't agree with it, you'll be better informed about what Christians believe. If you are a Christian and you want to get better informed about those arguments, then it starts January 13th. It's from 7 to 9 in the evening on Sundays. Again, there's a flyer on the back if you want to grab one, or you can sign up to receive our newsletters. And that's my quick ad.
So they can find out about that if they like. I think the young lady in the dark jacket was first, and then who wants to go? Both your hand. Go ahead.
Okay, I have a question for this side. So I'm attempting to study biology. I just wanted clarification on this. If a cell occurred by chance, just in the proper conditions, and by stages, it just like wasn't life all at once. In what order did the organelles that are vital to the cell's effectiveness, in what order did they appear? Because as far as I'm concerned, without each individual parts, whether it be eukaryotic or prokaryotic, they cannot function and are irreducibly complex. And they can't function without one of the organelles. I just am curious.
Irreducibly complex. They can't function without the organelles. That's interesting because prokaryotes don't have organelles, and they function just fine. In fact, that's bacteria. So I don't know about that. But in terms of which order do the organelles appear, we can trace the evolutionary origins of some of the organelles in the cell. For example, mitochondria have separate genome you have two genomes, in fact. You have your nuclear DNA, and you also have mitochondrial DNA. And you inherit your mitochondrial DNA only from your mother. So the mitochondrial DNA is actually just a loop, which is more similar to bacterial genomes. If you look at the nuclear DNA, by contrast, is linear chromosomes. And from that and from other evidence, we've been able to, we can get a pretty good idea where mitochondria came from. This is what's called endosymbiosis theory. Originally they were prokaryotic cells, bacteria. At one point were engulfed by a eukaryotic cell, were incorporated into that cell, and that eventually turned into a relationship that was beneficial for both parties. So in terms of how could a eukaryotic cell have evolved, I think that the example of mitochondria and chloroplasts are similar in many ways. They again have a genome separate from the nuclear DNA. Gives a very good example of how that could have happened. And in terms of irreducible complexity, this is another phrase that creationists have been bandying around a lot in recent years. They like to identify systems where They can't think of a way the system could have evolved, and so they say, well, this is irreducibly complex. Like the bacterial flagellum or the blood clotting cascade, I think, are the two favorite examples. It's very often difficult to pin them down on what exactly they mean. But usually, the definition that you hear is a system that will not function if you remove one of the parts that's involved. But that's assuming this system always had the same function. If we look at the bacterial flagellum, for example, the proteins that are involved in that structure differ from one bacterium to another. So obviously, you don't need all of those proteins for the flagellum to work. And there's actually a simpler system called the type 3 secretion system, which is something that bacteria that cause disease, like the bacteria that cause bubonic plague, will use to attack your immune system. The type 3 secretion system is like a flagellum, but minus a number of parts. So clearly the flagellum can function with a number of parts removed, if it's performing a different function. So, you know, when creationists like to say that something is irreducibly complex, I think that they need to define more clearly what they mean, because, you know, again, from looking at the flagellum, or the blood clotting cascade, again, is another example. There are, you know, one of the proteins involved in the blood clotting cascade in humans, Hageman factor, if I recall correctly, is absent in whales, but the blood clotting cascade in whales works just fine. And if you look at insects, you can find greatly reduced versions of the blood clotting cascade that are missing a number of proteins that you have in the human cascade, and that serve an entirely different purpose, trapping and engulfing, invading bacteria. So, you know, if you say that a system can't function with parts removed, you're assuming it's always performed the same function, and you're assuming that parts can't be adapted to perform a different function, when clearly we see that both of those take place and have taken place in the past. So sorry to ramble on, but yeah.
Thank you. You want a quick response to that? And a gentleman's been waiting. I'm going to give him a chance to get in the last question. So you'll have a chance, sir. Go ahead.
Really quickly on the flagellum. So the thing you talked about that's simpler, the type 3 secretory system, or however you pronounce that, yeah. There's actually a paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that says that the simpler one, they believe, evolved from the more complex one, like based on how the structures work. So they still have no explanation for the more complex one. This is from the abstract of that article, which is called Phylogenetic Analyses of the Constituents of Type 3 Protein Secretion Systems. And they said in the end of their abstract, we suggest that the flagellar apparatus was the evolutionary precursor of type 3 protein secretion systems. So that system doesn't do anything to explain the more complex flagellum, because they think that the simpler one came later. So they're still left without any explanation for the more complex one. Not to mention, even if you could get from the more simple one to the more complex one, to get that completely new function, you need like 2/3 more proteins doing all kinds of different things, which need to be encoded for both their creation and their function in the DNA, and that code has to come from somewhere. So it's not just going to write itself, no matter how long you have.
Yeah, and to add to that, that's called the co-option argument. What he's talking about is that the bacterial flagellum has all these parts, and it's true that there are other organisms that have those parts. The problem is the bacterial flagellum has more than 20 parts that are unique to itself, that are from no other organism. And so this is the big problem. Okay, even if there are some parts that are in other things, it still has parts that nothing else has, and so that's the problem.
Okay, and our last question of the evening is going to go to this gentleman who's been patiently waiting. Go ahead.
Okay, so I guess my question here is, given that you have evolution as a science.
I'm sorry, you know what? I was pointing at, yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I'm not.
This gentleman with the checker.
Okay. Oh, me, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did have a question. I just would like to know how the atheists will reconcile their belief in evolution with the second law of thermodynamics, since the whole...
I would love to answer that question.
Well, I'm just saying, if
I was surprised that didn't come up earlier this
evening. Done with my question. What I'm saying is, if evolution is stating that things are evolving from a state of disorder into order, I mean, how can that be? Because if a law is a law, that means that it's happening. I'm assuming in science, Kevin, you can. So doesn't that mean if it's a law that it happens every single time? Like the law of gravity, if you drop something, it's going to fall 100% of the time. So if everything is if the law of entropy is saying that everything is breaking down and going from order into disorder, then, I mean, the evolution, that theory is totally opposite of this scientific law. So how do you answer that?
First of all, entropy is not disorder. Secondly, by your argument, you say that you're saying that evolution can't happen because entropy would decrease, but by the same argument, babies would never grow and water would never freeze. When water freezes into ice, the entropy of that water decreases. But that happens because during that process, the entropy of the surroundings increases by a greater amount if the temperature is below 0 degrees C. That's why water freezes at 0 degrees C and not above. So entropy, the second law of thermodynamics dictates that entropy will always increase in a closed system, meaning a system that can't exchange energy with its environment. The Earth is not a closed system. We receive energy from the sun. That's why plants are able to power photosynthetic reactions. Photosynthetic reactions wouldn't happen of their own accord because that would involve a net decrease in entropy. But you can use energy that we get from the sun to drive those reactions. So the second law of thermodynamics states that entropy will tend to increase in a closed system. And Earth is not a closed system, so that doesn't apply. Again, if we look at the example of a baby growing, from your argument, you would say that can't happen because, the baby is you're using processes like cell division and DNA replication that involve a decrease in entropy. But again, the baby isn't a closed system. It's using energy from its environment in the form of food to power those processes. And finally, in terms of entropy, a lot of people think that entropy is disorder because that's what they tell you in high school classes and so forth, because it's kind of a complicated concept and they don't really want to get into it. I don't know how much time I have here, but I was hoping there was but what entropy really is, the way I like to define it, without going into the math, is what Richard Feynman once said. Entropy measures the number of ways you can arrange something on the inside, so it looks the same from the outside. So one way to think about this is in terms of the number of possible arrangements of molecules that correspond to a given state. Because if we look at a system, it has variables that we can measure. It has a pressure, it has a volume, it has a temperature, and so on. So those correspond to its macro state, the state we can observe. But there are a lot of different combinations, a lot of different arrangements of the molecules in that system that could give rise to that macro state. And so what the second law is really saying is that a system will tend to occupy the macro state that corresponds to the greatest number of arrangements, of possible arrangements. And another good analogy that I like to use to think about that is the game of poker. You all know how to play poker, I'm sure. Yeah, okay. If somebody said, no, I was going to be okay. But, if you think about, like, say, which type of hand are you more likely to get? A straight flush or two pairs? Two pairs, right? And you know that just from playing poker in the past. But why is that? It's because there's a greater number of possible combinations that will give rise to two pairs than to a straight flush. And the same way with the second law of thermodynamics, a system is always going to tend towards the macro state that corresponds to the greatest number of possible arrangements of molecules. That's what the second law is really all about. But again, that applies to closed systems, and that's not what we're talking about here.
Okay, I think at this, real quick, and that'll be our concluding remarks.
Well, I was just going to say that the universe is a closed system, and that's the bigger problem, is that the whole universe is tending towards entropy. And it's true that heat can be added from the sun to the earth. This is true, and the earth is not a closed system. This is right. But it takes something to organize that energy and make it useful. Entropy is simply that energy is turning into heat, which is the most useless form of energy. That's what's coming off the sun. Entropy is happening. That's why you hear about the heat death of the universe. Because what's happening is the whole universe is turning into useless heat energy. It's going towards an equal temperature, which means everything will stop moving, everything will all energy will stop. Okay, and that's what's happening. Everything will die. Okay, and this is agreed by atheists and Christians alike. All things tend towards entropy. Now, the only reason that a baby can grow and the cells add and all that sort of thing is because you have a living organism that's been programmed to take that energy and make it useful. That's why when I eat food, I convert it into energy and I can walk around and do things. It's because I'm a machine made by God that is able to use that energy, okay? The plants are able to take in the sunlight. You know that chlorophyll is crazy. It's more complex than an entire city. To have chlorophyll is crazy. The design in chlorophyll and in plants is amazing, okay? And it's been made by God to suck in that energy and turn it into something useful. That is not some like, you know, hey, lickety split, there you go. And so the only reason that we have that energy being converted is because you have a very, very complex machine that's able to harness that energy, just like solar panels that we have to make and we have to design, okay, to make that happen. Yeah.
Can we have a hand for both our teams? Really excellent questions from the audience. Thanks for coming out. Is it so that we're trying to make this a series? This might be the beginning of a series in these debates? Might be. So with that concluding thought, I guess the groups will keep you posted. Maybe we can have people see you come out again. The panelists might be up here if you have a question for them individually, if they choose to stay.
Please sign up for the mailing list in the back if you want to know of upcoming debates in the future. I'd love to have that.
I think